Welcome to the Data Bites podcast, brought to you by Women in Data. My name is Sadie St. Lawrence, and it's my pleasure to be your host for these weekly interviews where we share inspiring stories, thought leaderships, and discussions to help you excel in your data career. At Women in Data, our mission is to increase diversity in data careers, and we do this through awareness, education, and empowerment. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Rob Collie, founder and CEO of P3 Adaptive. Prior to his work at P3, Rob was a senior program manager for Microsoft and worked on products such as Excel, PowerPivot, and more. In this episode, we discuss the love-hate relationship with Excel, how to find the data gene in individuals at your organization, and how to become a super PowerBi user. In addition, Rob shares how he continually is learning and updating policies to create a more inclusive working environment at P3, and Rob brings his authentic self to this conversation. I think you'll find his stories engaging and insightful, and I know we all will have something to learn from this conversation. Enjoy. Rob, welcome to the Data Bites podcast. So happy to be doing this podcast swap with you, and I'm feeling a little bit of the pressure because we had such a great conversation, or at least I did, being a guest on your show. And so really appreciate you taking the time to come and be a guest on the Data Bites podcast today.
Well, I mean, the pressure is mutual, right? Like we had a really good show. So let's see if we can run it back in reverse. No, I really appreciate you having me on. This is great.
Well, if not, I'll just point people over to your podcast in that episode and we'll make it work. But I have a feeling
We've got that fallback.
Yes,
Yeah,
no pressure. The pressure is off today. So
that's right. Okay.
I want to dive in because the last time we talked a lot about my journey in starting Women in Data and what that was like. But you also have a founder's journey. And to me, like founder's journeys are one of the most inspiring and exciting stories. So take us back to how it started. Did it start in childhood? Were you always an entrepreneur? Did you love
No,
dashboards from a child? What happened
no,
here?
no. I was always a nerd for sure, and like not the cool kind either, right? Like like the like the classic '80s, you know, put upon bullied nerd, that kind of nerd. So always very much into math and science and all that kind of stuff, but um, never had any real direction. Like not an ambitious kid, and I just kind of went where the system sent me, or where I felt like I could derive some like enjoyment essentially. And so anyway, I went to college. I did a computer science degree. It was really cool. That program allowed a lot of flexibility, so I picked up a philosophy major along the way, and enjoyed that a lot more than I enjoyed the computer science stuff. And went to Microsoft, not because I had some ambition of being a software engineer. It was just sort of like the best job that I interviewed for out of college. I had debated grad school, but got to the front of the line for like the whatever the graduate tests are, and my checkbook was empty. I didn't have any more checks left. Well, it wasn't meant to be, so I'll just go get a job. It shows you how sort of driven. Um, at Microsoft, I ended up working mostly on Excel, and even that was an accident. Like there was at one point in time where I told a manager at Microsoft before I went to work on Excel that like going to work on something like Excel, I told this person, I would never, for example, I would never go to work on something like Excel. Like it was so beneath me, like in my youthful arrogance. And I was talking about the place where I would feel most at home without knowing it. And so I ended up on the Excel team just by reorganization accident. I'm like, oh, this is kind of cool, you know.
So I have to
Um,
ask a quick question about Excel because
sure.
I feel like Excel gets a lot of bad rep, right? Like there's so many memes out there
Yeah.
about Excel. And you're saying even back in the day, what was this? Was this the 90s that you were working on Excel? Like,
Yeah. It's
was
probably
it still getting a bad rap then? I mean, is poor Excel like the bedrock of all we do with data? Right?
yeah.
Was it always
Yeah.
looked at as kind of this like nobody wants to be associated with Excel?
So I think at Microsoft the reasons for this reputation for saying what I said are different than they are in the real world. I mean, there might be sort of related. They might have a cousin in there, but it was more like at Microsoft, especially like in the late 90s, early 2000s. Um, that version of Microsoft wasn't super in tune with what customers really wanted. And so on another podcast with a friend of mine recently, we were laughing about how almost everything at a certain point in time at Microsoft, every idea you were going to put into a product or every product idea almost invariably started with, wouldn't it be cool if? Um, and it had to be cool within that room, the room at Microsoft where you were pitching it. It had to be different and innovative and like a flex on the person who was presenting the idea, like sort of like showing off how smart they were or whatever. And so none of the core applications in Office where I was working at the time, none of those were considered a hot place to work. It wasn't just Excel. Like, I mean, Excel was probably in some ways a cooler place to work than Word. But it's funny, when I ended up working on Excel and I would try to recruit other people to come work on Excel, um, I found that people were really intimidated by it at Microsoft. Like, whereas everyone who'd worked on Word, everyone knew what Word was. Everyone knew what Outlook was, and um, but Excel, unless you've used, as you and I now know, right? Like when you get deep into Excel, it's a different world. It's deep, and people from outside of Excel could tell that. They could tell that there was something mysterious going on there, and they were scared by jumping into it. Um, but for me, it was just it was just a blanket disregard for any of the things that people were already like using and valuing. It wasn't, it was the wrong kind of of skepticism for sure. Yeah. It's a little different than the outside world. Uh, but recruiting people to come work on it, I think that does resemble sort of the way Excel is treated in the real world. Like everyone kind of looks down on it if you're not a data gene person, you're not carrying that particular whatever it is. Um, they don't look down on it while at the same time are intimidated by it. And that's a weird place to be, right? Like, if for something to feel beneath you and intimidating at the same time should tell you that something's off, right? Like your perception of this thing isn't, these things aren't really compatible. But that's the way of the world, unfortunately.
A lot of people are intimidated by it because there's this fear of numbers, and essentially that's usually what Excel is storing is numbers and data. And so many have, unfortunately, like childhood trauma with math and working with math. And so by just having that first replication of like, oh, it's going to be numbers and these sales, like there's this intimidation. And then what happens from that intimidation is you just look down on it by saying, hey, that's not for me. And it's a good way to excuse it. Or is there something more going on with it? I didn't
Well,
mean
I think
this to be a whole psychoanalysis
oh,
of
no,
Excel.
let's no, this is the good stuff. Way more important, actually. I mean, we'll eventually get to my story, but this stuff that I think is fine. I personally find the most fascinating. So, like by that, I think there's absolutely something to what you're saying there. That the experience, the experience of math and science and all those sorts of things that were inflicted on people in high school, that leaves a mark, an unfortunate mark. It didn't have to be done that way. If you look back, like, did we really need calculus? Like, like all the kids that were sitting in the calculus class with me saying, "When are we ever going to use this?" They were right. Like, I never used it. Like I was captain of the calculus team in high school, uh, and I never used it. So I was like, I think the results are in. But so like, but by that lens, right? Like, I should have been the absolute most enthusiastic about going to work on Excel, and so it was more like I was just looking down on an established, boring, quote unquote, boring tool. But I think there's another thing about Excel though, which is that um, we it is, it is a programming language. Excel formulas they pass every definition of a programming language, every formal definition. And so from the outside, I think there's an intimidation there that's not, people don't understand. Like the first time you see someone doing like this this VLOOKUP formula, you just look over their shoulder and you see this equals and there's parentheses and there's dollar signs and letters and numbers. Like it's rightly intimidating.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and the person who's doing it is so excited about showing you, the person who's showing it off, right? Like they're past all of that initial hurdle of intimidation. And so they're not, probably not, being terribly sympathetic to the person they're showing it to. They're saying, hey, look, this is easy. And so they're pitching it the wrong way. You know, like there's a, I think people are right to be scared of Excel given the way that they're typically introduced to it. You know, and the people who take to it are ultimately the ones that end up sitting down and trying to do something with it, like initially anyway, without someone coaching them. It's a solo journey to become comfortable with these parentheses and the dollar signs and all of that. And then once you become comfortable with that, then you can take mentoring. But that initial, getting through the initial like immune response is tricky.
Yeah, I think you make a great point because of how deep Excel goes, right? So when you open it up, it looks like every other Microsoft product, right? I mean, the
Yeah,
ribbon is similar. So if you're used to Word, you're like, okay, I feel comfortable with this. I've used PowerPoint, I've used Word, you dive into Excel. And then next thing you know, somebody's pulling up a VLOOKUP formula that you've never
yeah,
seen before,
yeah,
and lights go off, trauma response of your calculus classes
yeah,
start get reinvigorated. So yeah, I can definitely see it's like it looks comfortable to get into, and then all of a sudden it can be a rude awakening for folks who haven't had that opportunity or experience to dive into it before. But you took this
yeah.
and you were placed on the Excel team and turned this into something inspiring and something that led to your next pivot point. So, what happened after you joined the Excel team?
So on the 2007 release of Excel, which by the way is the release where the ribbon was introduced into Office, so it sort of gives you like a historical anchoring point. I was put in charge of on the program management side anyway, the design side and the sort of the strategy side um, of the all the business intelligence related features in that release of Core Excel. And I don't really, I laughed with my mentor on another podcast about this, who had a hand in selecting me for this job. And I was like, looking back, I'm like, why? Why did why did you pick me for this? I didn't know anything. And so that's where I got to know the business intelligence space, and I got to know the SQL Server team that was, or a faction thereof that at Microsoft was sort of the primary, you know, banner, standard carrier for BI at Microsoft. And so um, so I got to know what that looked like from designing a front end features on top of a what at the time was SQL Server Analysis Services, the original version of SSAS, which we'll get to this, but like it morphs into Power BI in the historical progression. So I got to know a lot of those people, um, and so that was my first. So I learned the Excel crowd. I'd really learned what the Excel user was all about, especially like the VLOOKUP and pivot table crowd, which sooner or later we'll start calling it the XLOOKUP and pivot table crowd because XLOOKUP is now so much better than VLOOKUP. But I have to revisit my memes at some point. But um, so I learned about the Excel crowd, and then I learned about the traditional business intelligence sort of industry and universe. Um, and then more accidents happen. Like I made what was in hindsight a really silly move for my career, which was I left the Excel team, and I'd sort of like made my mark there. I had become sort of like I'd built a good reputation. Like there were succession plans for Excel that had my name in it. Like this is the sort of like thing that a career minded person would be like, I've arrived. And instead, I went and left and went to work on Microsoft Fantasy Sports, uh, which was such a good idea that it got canned within 6 months of me moving over there, and I was now like looking for another job. But it turned out to be very important because while I was working on Microsoft Fantasy Sports, I had this idea, and it got buy-in, which was to build Microsoft to build like the world's number one publicly available sports statistics portal, the number one place to go to get statistics about football, American football in particular at the time. And so this became a project using the technology I just come from. So with Excel and web Excel as the front end, and analysis services, the traditional business intelligence stack on the back end, and integration services to do all of the data, munging ETL stuff. And I didn't know how to do any of that. I mean, even though I'd worked very close with it, like I wasn't a skilled practitioner of like the MDX formula language, and I never became one. So we hired a consulting organization, um, and to come in and do this for us. And so now I got to experience. I'd helped build traditional BI software. Now I got to see it from the customer lens, and it wasn't, in hindsight, it was bad. It wasn't a good experience. And but that just sort of got filed away for later. But like having that, turning the tables experience ended up being very important. And then the third data point was after fantasy sports got canceled completely because Microsoft realized strategically this didn't make any sense, and young Rob should have known that this didn't make any sense. It shouldn't have gone over there. But then I got recruited by the analysis services team to come and help them on this thing they call Project Gemini. I'm like, ooh, that sounds cool. What is Project Gemini? And Project Gemini, originally, eventually when it went to market in 2010, it was called PowerPivot. And PowerPivot is the true forerunner to Power BI. And the reason that I was, I'd made a favorable impression, I guess, when I'd worked with them on the 2007 Excel release, but they really wanted someone to come in and help them anchor the Excel user in this world because that was their target. This was a huge, huge, risky, ambitious change in focus for the analysis services team because they had traditionally, just like everybody else, Business Objects, Cognos, all these traditional players, had always targeted like almost like the high end IT professional as the developer of models, as the person who would be writing formulas, the person who would be writing logic. And this was Microsoft's first foray into what they now call the citizen developer space. And so they specifically wanted the VLOOKUP and pivot table crowd to become capable of building high-end business intelligence solutions. And what a fascinating project. And so, have you ever seen PowerPivot? You ever even, like, it didn't, it was a good first step, but it, didn't get a lot of I don't know, exposure, I guess, is the.
Yeah, I was never exposed to that world. And this is what I love talking to people is to hear the history of like what was originally like the first version of it, right? In my understanding, like history of Power BI was just like Power BI, that was it, right? It kind of took everything. But I had no idea the world of Power Pivot existed prior to this.
Like if you open your copy of Excel today, at least on PC Excel, I'm not sure if they ever put it in Mac Excel. I think they probably didn't. Um, but Windows Excel, if you open it today, you go into the add-ins menu, you can enable Power Pivot. It's already there. And so at a really high level, imagine being able to build massive data models, containing millions and millions of rows, or only tens of thousands if that's all you had, and interrelate them in a way that and run calculations across them that in Excel would be incredibly labor intensive. Um, and we built it for the pivot table crowd. And so so that was sort of the third piece of experience. And then I guess the sort of the crowning jewel on top of it was I started a blog about Power Pivot, and I needed something to write about. And so I did the lazy thing, which was let's just go rebuild that thing I did for fantasy sports. Let's go rebuild it, but with PowerPivot, and I'll document, what I was doing, throughout. I needed just like, some, reliable thing to come back to as a generator of content for a blog, And I did not expect it to be very good. This is version one of PowerPivot. And I'd been to this rodeo a lot. I'd seen so many really, really ambitious version one product. Remember, I was the wouldn't it be cool if person, right? I only worked on new stuff. That was what I wanted to do. And it was always disappointment. Like the
Yeah.
results were always nothing compared to what we originally envisioned, and it kind of fizzled a little bit in the world. And to my surprise, PowerPivot was amazing. Like it exceeded every realistic expectation I could have ever had for it, and only because of my sort of unique sequence of experiences at that point in time. Uh, seeing this story, this industry from so many different facets, um, and knowing the Excel crowd the way I knew them, um, that's when I realized that the world was going to change. That this citizen developer thing, which they hadn't called it citizen developer yet, like this was going to change the entire nature of what I thought of as the business intelligence market, which was even in 2010 when I was having this realization, it's already like, I don't know, like double digit or approaching 100 billion, somewhere in there, like of annual spend worldwide on, all up on services, on software, and all that kind of stuff. And the old sort of ivory tower model of you need to go get like the IT pro and then spend a tremendous amount of time and money just dragging yourself through the quicksand to get a relatively unimpressive result that you paid dearly for. Uh, like I had sort of known that was broken, but because there was no alternative to that model, I didn't really characterize it as broken. This is sort of like the best we can do. And when I saw that Power Pivot there was one formula I wrote in Power Pivot where it all became clear to me, like, because I wrote it in about 20 minutes. And I remember writing that same formula with the consultant back on the fantasy sports project. And that process took 2 weeks uh, in the original going. And it took me like 20 to 30 minutes with Power Pivot.
Yeah, and not
And
just from the consulting side of things, but also how a lot of teams are working in the day, which was, hey, I submit a ticket to my IT team or my,
right.
BI development team.
Yeah.
It takes
Yeah.
2 weeks for them to even acknowledge it. They didn't
That's right.
understand
That's
what
right.
I'm asking for.
Right.
And then I get this
Yeah.
product back 4 weeks later,
Yeah.
and the decision I was trying to make is no longer relevant, and this doesn't apply. Right.
Right. And on top of that, it's clear that there was a misunderstanding in the interpretation of the ticket, and they didn't even give me what I wanted. Um, and regardless of whose fault that is, if it takes you 4 weeks to discover the miscommunication, I imagine how demoralizing that can be. I remember seeing there was, I don't remember where I saw this. I wish I could track this down, but there was some sort of like industry metric on how many business days it took to add one additional column to an already existing report. And it was something like 9 business days.
Well,
And imagine if it was more nuanced,
yes.
um,
So
something
obviously
that,
the need of this citizen developer was huge, right? I mean, who has people who are new into the data space are probably like thinking we sound like dinosaurs talking about like, oh my goodness, I had to submit a ticket to add a column,
yeah,
Yes, you're lucky
yeah,
you live in today's day and age, right? Where you can do
yeah,
it yourself. But you were able to see that wave and say, this is going to be big, and get on the wave
yeah.
at the right time and the right place.
Yeah, I mean, there's a saying in finance that being too early is the same thing as being wrong. Um, I think I was probably too early, but that was good for me because, um, like I needed the time, and P3 needed the time to figure out the model of how to make all this work. And so, um, the fundamental idea behind P3 is that, um, the old ivory tower model operates on a very small number of projects every year, whether you're a consulting organization or a customer. There's very few projects executed every year. In fact, in some ways, it's like less than one because of the duration of these things running, it's 18, 24, 36 months. Um, and they're very expensive, for good reason, right? They're long, right? And um, but the vast majority of need for these projects is completely unaddressed. Even if you called that tiny, tiny, tiny sliver of 1% that actually gets budget and gets, traction, even if you called those a success, which by the way, they never were. I in all my years of studying this, I never found one that everyone was just like, yeah, this was a real, we just high five all the time about this. Like there was never one. There was like they only tolerated the results. But the remainder of them never even got addressed. No traction. Like if you worked at an SMB, small mid-sized business, chances are you didn't even have the budget to ever execute one ever. Not to mention all of the tremendous, departmental level needs at enterprises, like all of this completely unaddressed. And so the idea behind P3 was that with the new tools and with the new kind of practitioner, those projects that run for 18, 24, 36 months could actually be executed in like a matter of weeks, and therefore executed at a much lower cost as well. And then from a consulting perspective, that earns you the right to do all the other projects. It's like all that extra demand isn't going to go away. So the idea, the old model was huge monolithic projects, very few per year. That's what fed consulting companies. And the new model was going to be many, many, many projects, higher velocity projects, shorter, more intensive, better results, but more of them. Like an order of magnitude more projects per year. And I knew that the consulting firms that I'd worked with had been completely built around the old model, the monolithic, ivory tower model. And there was no way for them to just change their DNA. So we needed a new kind of firm. And that's what I set out to build with P3.
And I think, mhm. Yeah, and I think one of the changes too that's happened, I've seen a lot, is moving from hoarding to enablement, right? So as you mentioned, with the rise of the citizen developer, okay, if you want to bring value, you have to empower people, right? The tools are there, the access is there. How do you empower people? Versus before it was, how do I hoard all the projects so that I can do them and get that opportunity? Versus how do I enable people? Because I know the work isn't going to go away. I mean, we have more data being created every single day than ever before. So the more we can share our knowledge, and I love your story about how it started with the blog, because when you took your failures of trying different projects and working on the sports analytics team at Microsoft and use that as a starting point. And so I love where you're at with this, because some of the work I see you guys doing really is around enablement, empowerment, and training. And hey, we're not here to hog all the projects, but we're here to make sure you realize that value.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, the hoarding thing. There was something very much in common between the average IT organization and the consulting organizations, that both of them wanted to hoard control. And it's a slightly different dynamic, but like on the IT side, you can kind of understand it. Like even today, like IT, if you're truly working in IT, like infrastructural IT, you still, I believe, to this day, very rarely get noticed, except when things go wrong. You have a very defensive mindset because that's what's been inflicted on you. And so, like the world is sort of like trained IT, I think, unfortunately. Like IT didn't decide to be like, white knuckling hoarding things just because they're bad people, right? Like they're doing this because they know better, right? Like every time they allow others into the pool, they get blamed for the pollution, So there's some real long-term reinforcement and habits that need to be unlearned there. And on the other side, um, the consulting organizations, in order to be successful, they needed, and I've seen it, and it's just the nastiest dynamic. Like, they needed to wield an information advantage over their clients. Um, I sat in a room one time while a senior leader from one of these big consulting firms, not even big, just a traditional firm, was on a phone yelling at one of his direct reports and saying things like, "You realize that the client is in there right now having a meeting, talking about their needs and their futures, and they're thinking for themselves. Like, we can't have that." He was furious with his direct report for allowing this to happen. Um, and that's actually one of the nicest stories I can tell that I watched. And so, the hoarding from the consulting side, um, being deliberately mysterious, uh, almost, and not almost, deliberately obfuscating, making sure that the client could never be self-sufficient, even for a percentage of their own needs. That's part of their business model. And whereas, so I can be sympathetic with the IT one, they came by it honestly, right? This other consulting one, like the traditional consulting model, is one that, like, really, really, really rubs me the wrong way. Like, like, I'd never enjoyed even being in the same room. Like, those conversations felt dirty, even though I wasn't part of it. Uh, so yeah, the hoarding world has got to go.
Yeah. So how do we move to a space? I'm sure a lot of people can relate to this, even in their own organization, whether it's, they're working with consultants they feel like are hoarding, or, they have IT teams, or they're chief data officers and they're trying to inspire a culture of like innovation and knowledge sharing. Like, how do we truly enable an organization to become these citizen developers? And let's just use like Power BI as an example. Like,
Okay.
what are the best practices for? I've just adopted Power BI as a chief data officer. I'm giving it out to the entire organization. What's my next step? Like, what do I do to make sure this isn't just a tool sitting on a shelf, but I'm truly enabling people to think for themselves, to go and create, to discover these insights, and to be able to get value from this tool?
I My personal take on this is that, um, there's there's a misconception, which is that this democratization thing should treat everyone in the organization exactly the same way. uh, like, most people, and we talked about this, I'm pretty sure, if on the, like, I talk about the data gene as if it were an actual, it's just a thought concept, right? It's a construct, like a thought experiment. But, like, I've seen it, like, there are multiple different ways that we can arrive at this sort of number, but, like, about 1 out of 16 people at most has an interest in this stuff. Like, it's like the Excel test. Like, the first time writing like a sum formula that adds up the column of numbers, rather than typing them into a calculator or whatever over and over again. Um, if that if you have no reaction to that, if your first time you see that, you're like, so, then you're one of the 15 out of 16. But the 1 out of 16 goes, ooh. Again, it has nothing to do with whether you were into math in high school. Isn't that's the so beautiful? So many people
Yes.
become amazing data practitioners, and they weren't the calculus kids. Uh, they had too much perspective to be the calculus kid. Like, I lacked that perspective in high school. But I've changed teams. I like to think so. Um, the people that are going to make, like, a Power BI deployment successful, um, uh, for an organization, are probably already on staff, and they're people that, if you're like the chief data officer, or you're someone central, you've probably never met them.
Mhm.
Or there's a reasonably good chance you haven't. You've probably been meeting the people you meet from the business units, are the figurehead nominal leaders of those, and not nominal. I mean, they literally are the leaders of those organizations, but they're not going to be the data leaders of those organizations, because probably they lack the gene, right? They're not the person,
Mhm.
and but somewhere in their org are the people who are already doing this. Like, if you're still, like most people, I think, are still, most organizations, even today, are overwhelmingly dependent on Excel as their reporting engine. Uh, like the surface area of things like Power BI have like, quintupled over the years. Like, even if they're 100 times larger than they used to be, they're still in single digit percentage
Yeah.
in terms of like the overall, the amount of numbers that are crunched and real reports that are produced. It's still very often Excel.
So
And
how do we find these people though? I mean, do I go out and give everybody a test and be like, okay, I'm going to show you this. I'm going to
yeah,
do something in Excel.
yeah,
If their eyes light up, I have eye tracking on them, and if their eyes light
yeah,
up,
yeah, yeah,
then
yeah,
I'm like, ding, 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 I got one. And because
yeah,
that is some of the struggle, especially at a chief data officer level. You're not in the trenches. You don't get to see this
that's right.
hidden talent. Like,
Yeah,
is there a test
yeah.
that we can do, or what do we do to find the data gene?
Well, there's a couple of different ways. Like one of them is very similar to what you just said. Like, and this is just a long term. I used to pitch to Microsoft all the time, like in terms of like getting Power BI people interested or Power Pivot people, like getting the word out. Just putting posters like anywhere that just said like, you know, just 2 words like VLOOKUP, pivot table, and like 15 out of 16 people are just going to walk by that poster if it isn't even there. And one person out of 16 is going to stop and look at that poster going like, wait, well, why am I encountering this out in the real world where all the other people are? And like anyone that stops in front of that poster, like you screenshot them. Like, it's like the hunting cameras that they use, like the the trail cameras that they use to see where the deer are at night. Like it's the same sort of thing. So that's the joke version, but it would work. It would totally work.
Mm-hmm. Or
And the
maybe
other one
it's
is
like
you
a
could just
billboard in front of your office of like honk,
yeah
honk
yeah
if you
yeah
love
yeah
VLOOKUP, right? And
yeah
we'll
yeah
find those
yeah. If
people.
you yeah yeah if you get into a fender bender after that seeing that billboard, you probably yeah. Um, But I mean, the other one is sort of like it's just follow the spreadsheets. Like you can start at the top of a business unit, and as long as you have reasonably collaborative leadership in that business unit, you can say, okay, what are the spreadsheets you see every day? All right, so and then if they say, well, I really just get my information from, these mid-level managers that report to me, and so you just keep following backwards, and eventually you walk your way back down that org chart to the people who made the spreadsheets. Um, the people who are making the spreadsheets um, that power these, daily decisions. And again, people might not want to admit this. This is the thing you have to get past is that the managers might not want to admit that they're making their decisions based off of spreadsheets because they've been given this other system that they're supposed to be using, and they're going to potentially be defensive about admitting that like 80% of my decisions are still coming through spreadsheet things. um, so you have to find a way to get past that dynamic. um, but if you can work your way backwards to people who are producing these spreadsheets, you're going to find people who are curious. They're people like this tend to have a lot of curiosity. Um, they have a mind for technical subjects, even though if you ask them, they would say they didn't. They've passed all of the real tests of enthusiasm and skill and capability. Um, and just as valuable is that they're already embedded in the business. They already understand everything about the business unit, and they might be one of the most informed people about how things actually work, because their spreadsheets have to be correct, and that forces them to be in some ways like a historian slash librarian of like all of the unwritten rules, all the business logic, everything that's not written down, which you know just to absorb all of that is not something you can do overnight. Um, so um, they have an IT type job, but they're using a poor tool set. I mean, Excel is not a poor tool set. It's actually an amazing tool set in that it's capable of so much. But these people, if they were given something like Power BI, and we have, in my experience, we have a very, very high percentage like conversion rate. Like if someone's a VLOOKUP and pivot person, like we can turn them into, um, a Power BI person, because it's better at doing the things that they're already doing. They're going to be emotionally motivated to learn it, just like they were emotionally motivated to learn Excel. So yeah, working backwards, follow the spreadsheets. Um, you know, again, if you can get cooperation, like honesty in this process, you can find the people that you need.
Yeah, I think you make a really good call out to that. Even following the spreadsheet, some people may be afraid to admit that they're using Excel or, you know, Google Sheets, whatever tool you use at your organization. And I think that's important for us to think about is how much, if we are someone with the data gene, do we bash people or certain tools and how people use them? And I think it's important just to remember that it's never a good habit to do that, right? We should always be rewarding what somebody's doing with something, because the
Yeah,
second you ask, hey, how are you making decisions? And they know that you in another meeting made fun of people who use Excel,
yeah,
and
yeah,
they're less
yeah,
likely to say something now, right? I think it's just a good word of caution. I see it happen all the time, not just with Excel, but other tools, right? If you use R versus Python, or, if you're using an old classification model of a decision tree, and why aren't you building deep neural networks today, right? I mean, you can go on and name them. And I think we really need to be cautious about that, because who knows, that could be our next person who we need to talk to,
yeah.
has something of value, but we've shamed them so much into even having a conversation that that opportunity is gone now.
And I agree, and I think there's at least two distinct classes of sort of snobbery that we can talk about there. One of them is just a business world um, stigma attached to being the data person. Like if you're a spreadsheets and even a BI person. Now I know this is changing slowly because data has now been like the hot topic in business for a very long time. So it's seeping through the bedrock, but it's not overnight. But I've heard so many stories and witnessed so many stories of people being told, listen, if you want to continue to move up in the org, you're going to have to shed this reputation as the data person. Um, and I mean, not it's hard to imagine, right? Like, I mean, like not in our worlds, like places where you and I go, data is cool, but I think that is that dynamic doesn't die out, you know, rapidly. Um, it's going to require a lot of people to retire. Um, is what's going to have to happen, I think. And but then there's the technical world snobbery. You know, my software can beat up your software. It's almost like a kung fu movie. Like my master's kung fu better than your master's kung fu. Like um, and yeah, that second flavor is really unfortunate, isn't it? Um, and especially seeing how like so many of us in this space grew up. Speaking for myself here, I definitely did. I grew up as not the cool kid, you know, uh, and like you know, I know what it's like to be bullied, and then to turn around and like now that I've got power in the world because of software and tools and all this kind of to pay it back to others of like by making fun of their you know what they have found that is successful for them. Like yuck. Don't do that. Please don't do that. It's the
Yeah, I mean,
worst.
at that point, we just like keep the cycle going, and we
Yeah,
never evolve
yeah,
as humanity, right? Like
yeah,
taking what was like the saying goes, hurt people, but eventually we have to break that cycle.
yeah,
And so I think that's good motivation for all of us to just, watch the words we're using in terms of tools and language, and how we're making this world of data accessible to all. So we've talked a little bit about, from a CDO perspective, enabling a Power BI deployment, but from an individual perspective, how do you find out if you have that data gene, right? It sounds like, you get excited about working with these tools and the formulas and what you can do and the value that you have. But beyond getting excited about it, like how do you become really powerful? Now this sounds like some, mythical, like I want to become the superpower power
Yeah.
BI user. But
Yeah.
how do you become that? How do you level up your Power BI skills as a developer in a space?
One thing is to, you know, remind yourself that like um, almost any level of power is good. And not to judge yourself too harshly. So um, like when Power BI first came out and PowerPivot first came out, um, I had the advantage. I used to think of it as a disadvantage, but I think of it now completely as an advantage of there not being a lot of like DAX, for example, like the formula language of Power BI. There wasn't a lot of DAX expertise out there. It just wasn't. Um, and so I didn't have anything to compare myself to. So I could write a blog post where um, I could just like my ignorance, my lack of skill could be just completely on display and just displayed to the world. And people could write in comments and say, "Hey, I don't think your formula is actually returning the right results." And I go look at it and I go, "Oh, holy hell, you're right." You know, and then write the blog post, follow up blog post, which explains the mistake. And um, whereas now, if you go look at like for DAX blogs and DAX, how to videos and all kinds of stuff, you're just going to find an avalanche of information. And it's there's a form of accidental gatekeeping that is taking place now, which is that um, there's a lot of striving for the DAX to be optimal. And optimal DAX, hey, who doesn't like optimal, you know? But it's not friendly. It's very intimidating. And I wrote what for a long time, and maybe even in history now, is still this like the number one selling book on DAX, like in its day. I don't know if it still is. It probably isn't, but maybe just based on the inertia of of history, maybe it still holds the top spot. Um, and I don't know that I would get into it today, because of the level of sophistication and again this sort of accidental gatekeeping that's taken. I'm very sensitive to that kind of thing. I am self-critical, and and it's kind of like being, like we talked about earlier, like being shown a VLOOKUP formula by someone who's like really well versed in it. Um, and like that's going to have a repulsive effect, I think. And so first things first is to not judge yourself by the celebrities, because the celebrities of today would have scared off this person who, like, if you're joining Power BI today, you don't even know who I am. This is fine. Right? We've gone and formed a company instead. I'm no longer like a one of these, but like for a long time, I was the celebrity in this space, and I'm saying that I wouldn't have gotten into it with today's landscape. So be very, very, very kind to yourself. Be I haven't taught a class in a while, but when I used to, I would tell people your first job here is to be bad at this. Just like, because being bad at Power BI is still a superpower. It's like, oh, I can lift a skyscraper, but I can't lift the whole city. Like, don't judge yourself. Like, but you can't lift it. You're lifting a skyscraper. Like, don't don't forget. And like when I was learning, I would look back like every 6 months at what I did 6 months prior and look at the formulas and look how I built the data model and go, oh, I was so cute back then. Like I was so bad, relative to, 6 months later, I would look back and think I was an amateur. But that amateur performance was making millions and millions of dollars of tangible impact in the real world, for the organizations that were using it. It's like, do I need to go back and fix these formulas that are making them like super profitable compared to what they used to be? Probably not. you know um so like the old joke, wherever you go, there you are. um have some mercy and some sympathy with yourself, that you're not, you know that the celebrities would kind of giggle at what you're doing. Like it's okay. Just get, just like that usual thing, like just get a little bit better every day, and the cumulative results are going to be a big deal. Um,
I
yeah,
think
I'm not
that's
sure if
so
that's a complete
important for,
answer.
no, I think that's perfect. And I think it's just such an important nugget, whether you're doing it in Power BI or something else. I mean, I've seen LinkedIn really transform. LinkedIn used to be like a place you go maybe once or twice a week, and you were only on there if you were really looking for a job, to what it is now today of like influencer marketing was what I'd
Yeah,
say. And so
yeah,
I think that's such an important call out of like, one, don't judge yourself based on the celebrity, because they've also taken the collective body of knowledge of the people who have come before them and accumulated that. And then the other side of things is you don't know where someone else is on their journey versus where you are, right? And
yeah.
their story, they may be at chapter 10 where you're at chapter 2, and you have so much story left in your book to
Yes,
share.
yes, yeah. I completely agree. LinkedIn has become, I you know the reputation that Facebook rightly earned even years
Yes.
ago was, like everyone, it's like this insecurity machine,
Mm-hmm.
where everyone that's posting is only showing you the best things about their life, and everything is like a humble brag, right?
Oh, so
Everything's a
do you know I
flex.
have a mathematical equation? Well, it's not really an equation, it's very simple. Like, I'm not pulling out any VLOOKUPs. So you bring up a great question of how it's such a highlight reel. And so I was thinking about that, and I was like, how much of a highlight, like, can I quantify like a
Mm,
highlight reel? And so one of the things I looked at was I have had an iPhone since 2016,
okay.
and I have always had the iCloud photos. And so all my photos are stored on my phone. And so I thought about it, and I was like, oh, I know how many photos I've ever taken myself. And that's every photo. Like, that's the photos that are bad that I
That's
don't
the
post,
camera.
right? Like,
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
like, if I, let's just say I gave and put it on LinkedIn all of my photos, right? Like, how much of my life would someone actually see? And so I just made like a simple equation, was like, let's say it takes 1 second to take a photo, right? So each of those photos represent a second of my life. Now, photos are faster than that, but it really is just capturing a moment,
yeah.
right? So I took the time of how long I had photos of when they first started to now, looked up on Google and converted that to seconds, divided it by, how many photos I have. And you know how much it represented? I have 17,000 photos, right? If I were to share all 17,000 on social media, it was like 0.0000007% of my life, right? And that's if I shared all
Yeah,
17,000. So just
yeah,
to add some perspective to people, not only are you seeing a highlight reel on social media, you're not even seeing that. You're not even seeing the 17,000
yeah,
photos in their phone.
yeah,
You are seeing a vision, inspiration vision board is really what
yeah,
it is, right?
yeah,
So,
yeah.
next time you get curious and need some perspective, just quantify how much of their life you're really seeing.
And like, the average photo that's taken even of people, isn't candid, you know? Like everyone all smiling at the same time. That doesn't happen, you know? Get the same split second. There's, I mean, like, it is, of course, there's something authentic about that picture for sure. At the same time, though, like, even that is staged, you know? So, like, it's, yeah, I thought you were going to say, like, oh, and I've posted of those, 17,000 photos, I posted, like, 500 of them in total, but that'd be a hard one to add up, right? Like, how do you find the number of photos on LinkedIn and Facebook and all that sort of stuff? So it's even, yeah, it's even a tiny fraction of that. That's I've never thought about that. I think that's a great way. you know, um, I think that same dynamic has come to LinkedIn, and in fact, it's even more deliberate on LinkedIn. Um, I I even I find LinkedIn to be like a FOMO generating insecurity engine now. Um, I don't particularly enjoy it. um, and and obviously not everyone's treating it the same way, but there's a really strong percentage of ballast on LinkedIn now that I think is like, it's it's someone trying to represent themselves or their company or whatever in the best possible light, which I completely understand. It's just that as a side effect, it creates so much insecurity, uh, professional insecurity. Whereas Facebook, all it does is personal insecurity, um, and especially in a world where like the it seems like the number of jobs, like actually good jobs that are available in the world, like that seems to be shrinking. Like it's like this lifeboat drill where like every now and then another lifeboat is removed. Um, and then we have this going on LinkedIn. Like it's I can imagine the amount of sort of like emotional eh that's being generated. And so that comes back to the celebrities thing again. Like just remember that what's going on in your world. You know it better than anyone else in your professional world. Like what's going on at your company, and you know take the LinkedIn experience with a grain of salt.
I couldn't agree more. And I think the other side of things is, just focus on your own journey, right? And measure
Yeah,
your own progress, your own learning. I love what you tell people, which is when they're first learning something new, like your first goal is to be bad at it and to fail at it. And I think that's like such a good reminder for all of us to just have that space. So, shifting gears a little bit, one of the
hmm
things I really wanted to talk with you about is some of the changes you've made in terms of hiring and job descriptions to get
yeah,
more diverse candidates. So, can you talk a little bit? I know you're a big advocate and ally for diversity at your organization, but you went beyond just saying and stamp it, posting on LinkedIn that I'm an ally, right?
yeah,
You went into
yeah,
practice to say, how are we representing this and are we attracting the right people? So can you talk a little bit more about some of the changes you've made at P3 in terms of hiring and practices to attract the right candidates and to make an inclusive organization?
yeah. Um, yeah. Let's talk about that. And let me preface it actually by saying that like um, this diversity for us isn't just a good human thing. It isn't just a feel good thing. Like it's a business thing. Like even if we were a cold and calculating, completely like, um, like yeah, just robotic organization, which we're not. We're actually completely opposite. But even if we were, if we took that really seriously, we would say we've seen it. What I call the data gene cuts across all demographics at about that same 1 out of 16. I've never seen anything to suggest that it's concentrated in one place. You know, um, quite the opposite. It crops up everywhere. And it's rare everywhere, but it's but it's equally represented everywhere. And so, when we're looking at our applicant pool, and it's like majority white male, historically, like we're missing something. Like hiring is an important part of our growth. So like, oh, you want to like double the size of the candidate pool? Well, like the first thing you do is like, what about everybody that's not applying? And um, it's challenging because, well, this is something you and I talked about a little bit before. Like I wrote the original job descriptions, and I certainly intended them to be for everyone. But then like Christy on our team read them, and I'd read some articles about particular the ways things are worded, and said, hey, we're actually accidentally using a lot of like terms that overwhelmingly appeal to men. Like, really? What are they? And she said, so like I think one of our job description had um, said things like, every day you'll be like on the front lines of the data revolution. Like, and as soon as she said it, I'm like, oh, Dios mío. I'm using war metaphors in our job description.
And
Like
having been someone who I believe you haven't done any military service, it's not like, oh
no,
yes, that's something that
no,
I do on a
no,
daily basis either, right?
no. Like I was trying to describe excitement, you know, and like being in the thick of it, being on, and again, like even like guess what phrase comes next? Like the cutting edge. Is that is that a good phrase to use? I'm going to be more careful now, you know. Um, so we made a bunch of changes to the way that innocently worded things, you know, they can come from a good place, but still be, you know, the wrong wording. They can still be ineffective. They can, you know, like so get out of your own way and fix those things. Um, and then recently, another one that came up was uh, we had just left our travel policy, or at least the advertised version of it in our job description. We'd left it alone since pre-COVID. No one had even really thought about it. Um, and um, someone reached out to me on LinkedIn, or I reached out to her. I forget which, and she told me that she'd been thinking about applying, but and she wasn't really comfortable with the amount of travel that we talked about in our job description. And I just immediately went like, oh, I wonder what our I wonder what our description of travel is in our job description, because I bet it's super stale. And it was super stale, and we were saying 25% travel, and I was like, oh, we have not done anywhere near 25% travel. And but at the same time, it was the conversation with you on our podcast where we were talking about the amount of you know, sort of the invisible work around a household that that disproportionately falls on women. You know, this isn't something that we like or that we think is the correct state of the world, but it is a description of the way things on net have tended to work. And then I was like, I connected the dots immediately with that. It was like, oh, well, like, of course, travel, you know, like for a mom or a wife in this situation, both, um, be disproportionately sort of difficult for her than it would be for men. And this 25% had just been sitting there. It was like this stealth repulsor for, you know, for years. And since ever since COVID, we've never been near 25%. We ran the numbers in response to this, and it came out we were like 2 or 3%. Uh, it was the reality for us, and so we just changed it to travel optional. Like, you know, some people like it occasionally. You know, it's fun. Some people welcome it. Others really don't want to do it. And if we're at 2 or 3%, we certainly have the ability to absorb that from the audience that likes it. You know, so we changed it to travel optional, and she she applied that week and breezed through the interview, and was doing amazing work at one of our highest profile clients within her first couple of weeks. Um, it's like I'm so glad we had that conversation. If we hadn't had that conversation, you know, I mean, eventually we would have found this. Um, but yeah, I'm sure. And this is the thing. Based on this experience, I'm now looking for the other 7 places where we're accidentally doing things like this. Like there's no way that we've found them all, and some of them are going to be so subtle, like even, you know, obviously even more subtle than these things. And so like you know, people listening to this, uh, and you sent me the demographics, right? So like there's a lot of women listening to this. Look at our website, look at our careers page, p3adaptive.com. Tell us, you know, I'm just Rob at p3adaptive.com. Drop me an email. Tell me like, hey, these if you see one of the stealth things that we haven't discovered yet, um, or just in general, what would be discouraging of diversity. Um, we do not want to be a concentrated, you know, a company, you know, staffed by a concentrated single demographic. Um, it's wrong for every reason, you know,
And,
including the
and what I
hardcore
love
business
about
reasons.
Yeah, and what I love about your story here is you took almost a quantitative approach of go, wait, the data gene is everywhere, right? It doesn't
Yeah,
matter race, gender,
yeah,
how people identify, none of this matters. But for some reason, something's messed up with our sample that we're not getting that sample. And
totally,
then
totally.
had that openness, you know, same way you shared with putting your work out there in Power BI and getting feedback and not worrying about being perfect, right? Putting the openness out there, we're like, hey, I need feedback on this. What is wrong? What are some of those things that I'm missing? And to see, hey, there's language in here that, yeah, why is that in there? Right. And I think we all have those opportunities of like unconscious bias, or maybe it's just old terminology that we've picked up. And it's like,
Hmm.
why am I using this? This no longer serves me. And have the
Yeah,
opportunity to take that feedback, modify, change, see results, and then continue to iterate, right? It started with, hey, we're not going to put the front lines of data on there anymore, to, wait, could we change the language of travel options and make that more accessible to people?
yeah,
And now even having the call of putting your email out there and say, hey, go take a look at our website. If there's other things you see, like, we're open to it. We want feedback. This is how we learn and grow in this space, by having real conversations and being okay to quote unquote fail, right? So that we can be more inclusive and make sure that we're not oversampling the data gene for one population. So
yeah.
thank you.
I appreciate it. Well, thank you. Right? Like again, um, like the speed with which we reacted, I think we still would have reacted, but the speed and the clarity with which we reacted to this one um, conversation on LinkedIn about the travel policy, like it was so much more. Like we went, it was like 48 hours or less, and we had the policy updated. And I credit that to the conversation you and I had had. That was a really important link in that chain for me. So, um, yeah, like I used to be really um, insecure about discovering things I was wrong about. Like I would like almost like reject the information. Like, no, it's fine, you know. Um, and now it's more like it's just, those are the best moments. Like, oh, we've been making it harder than we need to. Let's not do that anymore.
Yes, I think that's something we could all take on, whether it's within our higher practices, our Power BI development is, we don't need to make it harder than it needs to. And when somebody gives
No,
us a piece of
no,
advice or feedback, you have the opportunity to accept it and change, to divert it and say, nope, I'm going to keep going my own way. But why make things harder than they need to be? So I
yeah.
think this is a great place for us to wrap up today. But before we
Okay.
close every episode, we love to go through some rapid fire questions and have some fun.
All right.
So if you're down, are you
I am.
ready for the
I'm ready.
rapid fire question?
Rapid
Okay, let's
fire.
let's do it. What song, podcast, or book can you not put down right now?
Oh well, song. I've got lots of songs. So, podcasts. Um,
Okay.
I listen to. Guess what? Back to my roots. I listen to the Roto World uh, fantasy football podcast because these are funny people, real human beings who are also using a lot of statistics, a lot of advanced metrics to make their recommendations and providing the narratives and the storytelling to go with it. And yeah, I can't get enough of that. So maybe maybe not the one that most people will listen to, but like when that comes out like 3 times a week, and I'm just like, oh, yeah, now I'm in. I just can't. I cannot put that down.
Favorite place you traveled?
Favorite place I've traveled. Um, Gosh, I think I like Costa Rica. Uh, it's got about that pace that I like. You know, super friendly. Yeah, we've gone back multiple times. Even though we don't really travel internationally all that much. Like for us to go back to another country, repeat it rather than use that that time slot on something brand new speaks highly. It's just one of the coolest places on earth.
Happiness is.
Oh, uh, wow. I think happiness is getting the balance um, between confidence and hubris correct. Like the right amount of comfort in your life is a very difficult thing to get right. Like feeling like you're useful, feeling like you're growing, um, and feeling like you're not complacent. Very difficult balance, very difficult little narrow band. And some people just decide to either always be comfortable. They never they're never uncomfortable. Um, and they tend to end up, I think, inflicting a lot of harm on the people around them with that, because they've become so externalizing of everything. And then there's the never comfortable, always insecure. And you've seen these people, like some of them are very, very, very successful, you know, titans of industry who you can tell they're miserable, uh, even in their success. And so um, I feel like I'm constantly kind of swinging back and forth through that equilibrium, like getting it right for a moment, like a spring bouncing back and forth, and like I'm never in the right place for very long.
All right, next question. In the next 5 years, I hope to.
Hmm. In the next 5 years, I hope to, first of all, on the professional front, like keep growing P3. Like um, we're a really good thing for our clients. We're a really good thing for our employees. Like we we're that style of business that I used to understand companies to be, like the old fashioned thing, like trading something to the world of value, and providing something of value to the employees. I don't think that's the way businesses are viewed so much. Maybe they never were, but they certainly aren't viewed that way today. Like, it's all about the multiple and the exit and blah blah blah. Um, and this is the single best thing I've ever been associated with in my career, and I hope to continue to to grow it and grow it and grow it aggressively because it's a good thing. So I hope that happens. Um, I would like to personally be um, you know find more outlets like this, like podcasts and things like that, where I think like sort of like some of my core strengths that I never would have thought years ago were my core strengths. Um, and sort of like storytelling and emotional connection and those sorts of things. Like I'd like to increasingly have that be part of my career, and and not just my, what was it we talked about? Was it you and I on my podcast talking about like the different all the different jobs, the multi-job people? Is that right? Like
Slash
you
careers.
had a phrase, slash careers, right? And I said, oh, I don't have one of those, and you said, yes, you do. And I'm like, well, how do you know? Maybe I do. So I'd like the slash parts of my career to sort of grow as a percentage of what I do. Um, that'd be good.
All right, last rapid fire question. To me, curiosity is.
Okay. So first of all, I think curiosity is an excitement. Um, an excitement about something that you don't know. Um, and like those things we are talking about earlier, like discovering the places that you were wrong or you were ignorant, and enjoying that. Um, and oftentimes even having this excitement about learning something that's in an area that might not be interesting on its own, right? Like it's one thing to be curious, I don't know, about your favorite musician or something, um, but to be curious about um, why a certain ad campaign has gone from being a strong performer to a poor performer, rather than just saying, well, that's just the way it is and it's probably just noise. Like being curious about that. Maybe there's some things changed. Maybe we made a mistake. I don't know. That's just the first example that comes to mind. Um, but also with other people, like I play this game with my kids. I'm not sure that it's taken with them. I call it benefit of the doubt. Like, I have a teenage son, uh, and he's a know-it-all. He's going through that phase, and and I went through it too. Give him the benefit of the doubt, but like he sees something that someone said or someone did, and he goes, he immediately says, well, "That's just so dumb." I said, "Well, why would they do that? Let's pretend that they're not dumb first, and see if we can figure out a way in which it all makes sense. Like try our hardest to understand why in their shoes, they would be doing or saying that. And if we really go at that aggressively, and then we fail to come up with something, we can fail to come up with a positive narrative that explains why they're doing what they're doing. Okay, then maybe then we can sort of more tentatively, at least tentatively, embrace like, okay, maybe that was a mistake, right? But don't go there first." um, and yeah, so yeah, like, isn't it cool to learn something that you didn't expect, as opposed to scary? You know, lean into that.
I love it. Well, thank you for taking the time to come on the Data Bites podcast. This has been a fun conversation as always. I'm so happy that we had the opportunity to go through a history of Excel and learn about how we enable organizations with Power BI, and appreciate your insightful tips and ignore the celebrities and fail a lot and try anyway. So thank you for all the work that you've done and sharing your story with us today. I know it'll be a great benefit to lots of people.
Oh, thank you for having me on. I know that it's a little bit longer recording than maybe what you usually do, so I appreciate you accommodating my more non my more verbose style.
I love it. And thank you to all our listeners for staying on with us until the end and making it here. As a reminder, stay curious and keep learning. And we'll catch you next time on the Data Bites podcast. Thanks, everyone. If you enjoyed today's conversation on the Data Bites podcast, we welcome you to continue the conversation and join our global community by becoming a member at womenindata.org. All Data Bites listeners receive 20% off using the promo code DataBites20.